I can.
Hold on, I gotta do my part. Okay, now, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
yeah, I
See
can
me
hear you.
okay? Thank you. See me okay?
Yes,
Okay,
yes,
great.
sir.
All right, so we're going to pick up with, well, I should have done this first. Okay, so we are going to, what do you see on the screen? You see a slide that has an American flag and a title that says the election of the president?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. Okay. So, as the title of the slide suggests, we're going to talk about the election of the president today, of this week, as part of a broader topic on elections, campaigns and elections. We've recently been through a presidential election, and last couple of presidential election cycles actually have been pretty interesting. But as with most of the things that we talk about in this course, we strive to lay out the normal, the normal features, the normal characteristics, the general patterns, and so on. And where appropriate, we can talk about specifics of, a particular. We can talk about particular events or the specifics of a particular, in this case, a particular presidential election, and so on. One of the things I think about the last couple of presidential elections is certainly the 2016 presidential election, and then again the 2000 presidential election, is that most Americans now understand, if they didn't before, that the election of the president is ultimately determined by this institution called the Electoral College. And I think many people understood that anyway, even without the 2000 election results and even without the 2016 election results. But I think now what people understand is that it is possible for one presidential candidate or ticket, vice presidential ticket, to win the national popular vote, and another presidential, vice presidential ticket to win the electoral vote, and therefore assume the offices of president and vice president. Because that, of course, was the result in both the 2000 presidential election and the 2016 presidential election. As you remember, in the 2016 presidential election, Hillary Clinton and her running mate Tim Kaine won the national popular vote by almost 3 million votes. I think somewhere around 3 million votes. They received more than the Republicans, Donald Trump and Mike Pence. But of course, Donald Trump and Mike Pence assumed the offices because they won the electoral vote. And then, of course, back in the year 2000, it was a much closer election between the Democrat Al Gore and the Republican George W. Bush. But Al Gore did win the national popular vote, but George W. Bush assumed the presidency because he won the electoral vote. So I think those two relatively recent presidential election outcomes has most Americans, as I say, think now understand that is a possibility. But again, we like to deal with the generalities in this course, and as I say, we can talk about specifics or exceptions to the general rules as appropriate. Generally speaking, the national popular vote and the electoral vote, coincide. Most presidential elections, the winner of the national popular vote also wins the electoral vote and becomes president. But the fact that it has happened twice in the last several presidential election cycles indicates that it's not something that we should gloss over. Okay, so anyway, we're going to talk about the election of the president, and we're going to actually take a step back from that and talk about some other features before we can get to those points. So let me begin by suggesting to you that the election of the president occurs in two phases. And this observation is true of many, many public offices in the United States. Certainly, it is true of those offices that are elected on a partisan basis. In other words, what I mean by that is if you have candidates who are running as nominees of political parties. So the presidency, elections for the United States Senate, elections for the United States House of Representatives, most statewide offices in Texas, from the governor and the lieutenant governor and the comptroller of public accounts and all the Texas Supreme Court justices and district court judges and appellate court judges and all the county offices in Texas, like county judge and county commissioners and sheriff, and all of those offices are what we call partisan-based elections or partisan elections. That is to say that the candidates run as nominees of political parties. There are some offices in the United States, mainly at the local level, that are elected on a nonpartisan basis. Certainly here in Texas, for example, school board candidates do not run as nominees of political parties, okay? Or elect mayoral candidates and city council candidates in Sugar Land or Richmond or Wharton or wherever you're at. They don't run as nominees of political parties. So those are nonpartisan elections, okay? So what we're going to be talking about here today and then into the class session on Thursday really are the first type, partisan elections. So what this comment that I have up here on the screen that says the election of the president occurs in two phases, really I could generalize from that and just say most public offices in the United States are elected in two phases. The president, certainly, but also U.S. senators, U.S. House members, governors, etc., are elected in two phases, okay? So that's point number one that you need to remember, okay? And just to sort of identify what those two phases are before we move on to point number two is that the first phase is a nomination process. That's the process that the Democratic Party uses or the Republican Party uses to nominate their candidates. Oftentimes we start with a field of candidates who say that they want to be, let me say that a little bit differently. We start with a number of Republicans who say they want to be the next U.S. senator. And we start with a number of Democrats who say they want to be the next U.S. senator from Texas. Let's say, for example, maybe you have 5 Democrats who want to be the next U.S. senator from Texas. How do you get from 5 Democrats to 1 Democrat? Okay? In the most recent U.S. Senate election, for example, here in Texas last November, there were, I think, 5 or 6 Democrats initially who wanted to be, who said they wanted to be the next U.S. senator. Okay. Ultimately, a woman by the name of M.J. Hagar won the Democratic Party's nomination for U.S. Senate, and then she faced off in the general election against Ted Cruz, who was already the incumbent U.S. senator. He's a Republican, right? Okay, so again, the nomination process is a process that either of the parties go through in order to winnow down a field of candidates to just one to run in the general election, to be their party's nominee in the general election. Okay, so again, that's true of the presidency. That's true of all these other offices that I've mentioned as well. Okay, the second phase is the general election. Okay, so once we're down to 1 Democrat and 1 Republican, then you have the general election. And of course, the results of the general election determine who that next U.S. senator is going to be, or the next U.S. representative is going to be from this district, or the next governor, or the next president for that matter. Okay? All right, so the election process for partisan-based election occurs in 2 phases. The nomination process and the general election. Now, this next point that I'm going to reveal to you is specific to the election of the presidency. But if you keep this in mind, a good chunk of the rest of the discussion that we're going to have will make a lot more sense. Okay? Both of these phases, both the nomination process and the general election, when it comes to the election of the president, are representative processes. And what I mean by that is that at no point do ordinary voters, people like you and me, I consider myself an ordinary voter, okay? At no point do ordinary voters cast a ballot directly for a presidential candidate, not in the nomination process and not in the general election. In the nomination process, whether people are aware of it or not, when they go into the voting booth and vote for Joe Biden or Pete Buttigieg or whoever the other Democratic candidates were that were on the ballot, or Donald Trump on the Republican side, whether they're aware of it or not, they're not actually voting for Joe Biden, okay, or Pete Buttigieg or Mike Bloomberg, right? They are voting for delegates to a national convention who are pledged to that candidate. That's in the first phase, in the nomination process. Now we're talking specifically about the presidency, about how this process applies to the presidency, okay? So when you go to vote, just a quick show of hands, did anybody vote in the 2020 primaries? Okay, oh, wow, excellent. So remember seeing, if you voted on the Republican side, it was a foregone conclusion, right? Because Donald Trump was the incumbent president, okay? And actually, in many of the states, the process was suspended by the Republican Party, okay? So if you voted in the Democratic primary in 2020 here in Texas, I don't know how many names were on the ballot, but it was certainly more than a couple, okay? Joe Biden's name was on the ballot. Mike Bloomberg's name was on the ballot. What were some of the other names? I'm drawing a blank here. Somebody help me remember. Amy Klobuchar.
Yang.
Was on the, who?
Andrew Yang.
Andrew Yang. Okay. I think at one point, whether all of these names appeared on the Texas ballot in March of 2020 is unlikely. But at one point, I think there were as many as 17 or 18 Democrats who said they wanted the Democratic Party's nomination. And of course, the Democrats had to have a process to get down to just one. Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders. We missed Bernie Sanders, right? Okay. So again, back to my initial point, if you go into the Texas primary in 2020, March of 2020, and vote for Bernie Sanders, you're not actually voting for Bernie Sanders. You're voting for delegates to a national convention who are pledged to vote for Bernie Sanders. If you went into the Texas primary, Democratic primary in Texas in March of 2020, and you voted for Joe Biden, you're not actually voting for Joe Biden. You're voting for delegates who are pledged to Joe Biden, okay? That's what I mean by a representative process in the nomination phase, okay? And of course, in the general election, as most people seem to understand now, you're not actually, if you voted in November of 2020 for Donald Trump, you're not actually voting for Donald Trump. You're voting for a slate of electors who, at the appropriate time, will cast their ballots for Donald Trump and his running mate, Mike Pence, right? If you voted for Joe Biden, you're not actually voting directly for Joe Biden. You're voting for electors who are pledged to Joe Biden and his running mate, Kamala Harris, okay? So that's what I mean when I say it's a representative process, all right? So again, if you keep that point in mind, those 2 points in mind, it's a two-phase process and both of the phases are representative. A lot of what we say the rest of the way should make more sense, okay? All right, so we're going to divide it up sequentially. Talk about the nomination process first, okay? And again, this phase has two components. The first is a series of state-by-state primaries and or caucuses that run from January to June of the presidential election year. So beginning in January 2020, the first process was the Iowa caucuses, followed a couple of weeks later by the New Hampshire primary, and then shortly after that, the South Carolina primary, and then a series of state primaries and caucuses culminating, well, I shouldn't say culminating, apexing perhaps on so-called Super Tuesday primaries and caucuses, where a whole bunch of states, including Texas, hold their primaries in early March. But through March and April and really into June, you have these state-run primaries and caucuses. And we're going to distinguish here in just a few minutes between a primary and caucus, okay? But the initial point that I'm really trying to make to you is that it occurs on a state-by-state basis. We don't have a single day where everybody across the country votes in a primary. And, technically, the purpose of this stage of these primaries and caucuses is to select delegates from each state to the party's national nominating convention. But we know, I use the word technically there very deliberately. Okay? Okay, so let me give you a chance to stop writing. Okay, get that little piece down. Okay? Because I don't want you to miss this. Okay? Technically, the party's presidential and vice presidential candidates are nominated at the National Nominating Convention by those delegates. Officially, maybe if you prefer the word officially, all right? Joe Biden did not become the Democratic Party's presidential candidate, and Kamala Harris did not become the Democratic Party's vice presidential candidate until the Democratic National Convention was held. Now, 2020 was a strange year in a lot of ways, but as it pertains to the national nominating conventions, it was strange because they were held remotely for the most part. The Republicans was a little bit different. As you recall, they went ahead with kind of an in-person event, at least with some limitations, but the Democrats held their national nominating convention because of the coronavirus entirely in a virtual sort of environment, right? But in previous years, in 2016 and in 2012 and in 2000 and so on, you would have had this large gathering of Democrats in a convention hall, in whatever city it was being held. And at some point, the delegates at that convention would cast ballots, and those ballots would be counted, and when one of the candidates achieved the requisite number of votes, the majority of the votes from the delegates, they would officially become the party's nominee, or technically become the party's nominee. So technically or officially, we don't really know who the party's nominee is until that process is done. However, and this is an important however, we know and have known in virtually every presidential election cycle for many decades who the party's nominees are going to be before those delegates actually convene and cast their ballots. We knew, for example, that Joe Biden was going to be the Democratic Party's nominee for president before the Democrats held their convention last summer. And in 2016, we knew that Hillary Clinton was going to be the Democratic Party nominee before the Democrats met in their convention, and that Donald Trump was going to be the Republican nominee in 2016. Before we know, in fact, in some cases, 3 or 4 months before the party conventions are actually held. So the fact that we can predict in 2016, for example, that Donald Trump was going to be the Republican Party nominee before the Republican convention was actually held, much less the delegates their votes, or that Hillary Clinton was going to be the Democratic Party nominee a couple of months before the Democratic National Convention was held and the Democratic delegates cast their votes, tells us something. Okay? It tells us that the votes of the delegates at the convention are very predictable. And so that effectively, even though technically the party's nominees are determined by this voting at the convention, effectively the party's nominees are determined by the votes cast by ordinary voters in the primaries and caucuses. You see the point I'm really trying to hammer home here, and I hope that it may be completely obvious to you, but I just want to make sure, okay? I started by saying that it's a representative process and at no point do you actually cast a ballot directly for a presidential candidate. But now what I'm telling you is that your votes in the primary do effectively determine who the party's nominee is going to be. Now, it's really difficult to generalize about this stage of the process because it varies substantially, not only from one state to another. Some states use primaries, a few states use caucuses, a few more states use a combination of primaries and caucuses. It really just depends on state law. So the process varies according to state law. You see, we have, under our Constitution, we have a situation where we don't really have a national election. The election of the president is not truly a national election. It is an election that occurs in 50 different states and in the District of Columbia. And the laws vary. The Constitution gives the states the authority to determine the election laws, even for the presidency. And we saw that. If you paid attention at all to the last presidential election, you know you've got to be aware, because of all the controversy, that there's differences in state election laws. So that's why I say it's very difficult to generalize because of those variations from state to state, even as it pertains to this part of the process, much less the general election. It also differs between the two parties. The rules of the Democratic Party are not the same as the rules of the Republican Party. So the way that the process works in the Republican Party in Texas is not the same as the way that it works in the Democratic Party in Texas. And then it varies from one presidential election cycle to the next. The way that it worked in 2020 was not the same as the way that it worked in 2016, which was not the same as the way that it worked in 2012, which was not the same as the way that it works in 2008, and so on. So it's really, really difficult to generalize about this part of the process. But we have to try to generalize, because otherwise we become overwhelmed with details and we can't make sense out of any of it. Now, we spent the week before spring break talking about the fact that we have a dominant two-party system in the United States. So what we're talking about here in today's class and into Thursday's class meeting is going to focus almost exclusively on the fact that we have a two-party system. And so everything I've described to you up to this point, and as we move forward over the next class meeting and a half, is mainly as it pertains to the Democratic and Republican Party processes. The two major parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, use some combination of primaries and caucuses. And again, we haven't distinguished between those two yet. We will. We should throw in, though, that there are other parties out there, minor parties, that run presidential and vice presidential candidates. The Libertarian Party, the Greens Party, the New Alliance Party, whatever may be out there at any given time. And there are a variety of mechanisms available to minor parties to nominate their candidates. It really just depends on state laws. Okay. Questions? All right, I want to stop here for just a moment and talk a little bit about the difference between primaries and caucuses. Actually, first I need to do this. I need to make this distinction first. I need to make the distinction between presidential preference primaries and a direct primary. As you might guess, the first of these two applies to the election of the president. And I've already described to you, what are you voting for in these presidential preference primaries?
The delegates that are
You're actually voting for delegates who are pledged to a candidate, right? So what do you think a direct primary suggests? And what does it apply? It doesn't apply to the presidency, right? It applies to all the other offices that are elected on a partisan basis. So U.S. Senator, U.S. Representatives, Governor, State Representatives, county offices, and so on, right? All those other offices that are elected on a partisan basis. What does direct primary suggest?
But you're not voting for the delegate, you're voting for the individual.
You're actually voting for that individual, right? So, in other words, if you go into the voting booth in March of 2020, in, let's say, the Democratic Party primary, in addition to seeing all of the candidates who are running for the Democratic Party's nomination for president, Biden and Sanders and all those names, you're also going to see, I don't know, I remember how many it was, but maybe 4 or 5 names who want to be the Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate to run against Ted Cruz in the general election. Right? As I told you a few minutes ago, MJ Hagar was the candidate that eventually prevailed, right? So if you voted for MJ Hagar and her motorcycle, remember those commercials of her riding her motorcycle? If you voted for MJ Hagar, if you cast your ballot for MJ Hagar, you are actually voting for MJ Hagar. And so at the end of the evening, when the primary day, I don't remember what day in March it was, but let's just say it was March 7th, okay? At the end of the evening, you go through, in Texas, you go through that early voting period, and then the actual day of the primary, right? The polls close at 7 p.m. And all the votes are counted up, and the candidate who has a majority of the votes becomes the party's nominee. That's a direct primary. So you've got the direct primary, which is a process that applies to all other offices except the presidency. Okay, now having made that distinction, let me back out of this and go back to this. I want to talk for a couple of minutes about how a presidential preference primary works. And I'm going to use initially here the Democratic Party nomination of the Democratic Party process in 2016. And the reason I used 2016 was because you didn't have an incumbent president running in 2016. Remember, Barack Obama had served his 2 terms, and he wasn't eligible to run for a third. So you had the Democrats, a large field of candidates who wanted to be the party's nominee, and you had a large field of Republicans that wanted to be the Republican nominee. And you can see the 2 big names that you'll remember from 2016, of course, were Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. Okay? And even though it has a big question mark here, it's just because I haven't updated it. Hillary Clinton, of course, eventually prevailed after a long process that the Democrats had in 2016, eventually prevailed over Bernie Sanders, who was her main rival, okay, for the Democratic nomination. Okay? But how did that process work? Well, the starting point is to understand that each state has a certain number of delegates to the Democratic National Convention. Okay? And it is based on, that number is based on a complicated formula. Believe me when I say it's complicated, it's complicated. A complicated formula, the main variable being the population of the state. So just that little bit of information, you should be able to tell me which state should have had the most delegates to the Democratic National Convention. Of course, because you know California is the most populous state. You say, oh, well, it must have been California. And you would have been right. Or what state had the second highest population? Texas, right? So Texas should have the second highest number of delegates to the Democratic National Convention. But if you had said that, you would have been wrong. Because Texas actually didn't have the second highest number of delegates. It was actually New York. That's why I say it's a complicated formula. It's one of the other variables that goes into this process is how many votes the party's candidates received in the previous election cycle. So, for example, you got to go back to 2012. Now, do you think that the Democratic ticket, anybody remember what the Democratic ticket was in 2012? Well, it was Barack Obama and Joe Biden. Okay? You think Barack Obama and Joe Biden received more votes in Texas or New York? New York, right? Because New York is a heavily Democratic state and Texas is a heavily Republican state. So that factors into the determination of how many delegates each state is going to get. Okay, so there are other variables that are part of that determination, but if we throw all the states out there, you can pick your favorite state and you can see how many delegates each had to the Democratic National Convention in 2016. Okay? Now, in order to be officially nominated then, a candidate must receive the votes of 2,382 delegates out of 4,763. That's a simple majority, 50% plus one, right, at the Democratic National Convention. At some point during that convention, those votes are going to be cast. And when one of the candidates gets to 2,382, that person officially becomes the Democratic nominee. And of course, that was Hillary Clinton in 2016. Okay? But how do we get to that point? Well, let's back up. Okay? Whatever state we're in, let's say it's New Hampshire or Texas or whatever, California or whatever the state is, voters line up, okay, whether it's in an early voting period or on actual primary day, all right? Queue up, as our British friends say, all right? And when it comes their turn to go into the voting booth or go to the voting station and cast their ballot, they cast their ballots for their preferred candidate, Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders or Martin O'Malley or Lincoln Chafee or Jim Webb or whoever else the other candidates were back in 2016. I'm going to fast forward through this. Okay, we're going to finally get to the end of the line at the end of primary day, and all the votes are going to be counted. Oops. And it ends up, this is a hypothetical, by the way, in a hypothetical state. This isn't based on any actual numbers or any actual state. Okay, let's say just for laughs that Hillary Clinton got 17% of the primary vote in the state. Okay, Bernie Sanders got 44% of the vote, and Martin O'Malley got 17%, and so on. Now, the Democrats have a rule that you have to have at least 15% of the primary vote in order to get any delegates at all. Why do you think the Democrats do that? Why do you think the Democrats have a rule, whatever state this is, a candidate has to get at least 15% of the vote to be entitled to any delegates? It's really a way to try to facilitate wrapping up the process, right? Because if you give delegates to people who are getting 8% or 9% or 10% or whatever, they may have an incentive to hang on, right? But if they're not getting any delegates because they can't get more than 15% of the vote, it's kind of an incentive for them to drop out. And the parties have a legitimate incentive to do that. If you think that's unfair, we'll consider the fact that the Republicans typically use in most states a winner take all. You win the primary vote in that state and you get all the state's delegates. Okay? The Republicans really want to wrap it up quickly. And by the way, that's why the Republicans typically wrap their process up faster than the Democrats wrap their process up. We knew, for example, in 2016 that Donald Trump was going to be the Republican nominee a couple of months, at least a couple of months before Hillary Clinton finally emerged over Bernie Sanders. The reason for that, by March of 2016, it was clear that Donald Trump was going to be the Republican nominee. But it was early June before Bernie Sanders conceded the race to Hillary Clinton. There's a consequence to these kinds of processes. The fact that the Republicans use typically a winner take all means that they're able, and why might they want to wrap their process up quicker?
Start that campaign.
Sure, they want to start their campaign against what they perceive as their actual opponents, the Democrats. Okay, so let's just assume these delegates here are reallocated. And again, this is hypothetical, but this is the way that it turns out. As a result of this primary voting, Bernie Sanders gets half of the delegates and Clinton gets 20%, et cetera. Okay? All right, so the next step then is the National Convention. At the National Nominating Convention, you have all of the delegates who are pledged to Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton from Wyoming, and all the delegates who are pledged to Hillary Clinton and Jim Webb from Delaware and so on from each of the states, go to the site of the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia, okay, where they're going to have at some point a roll call vote of the states in alphabetical order. Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, on down to Wyoming, right? And each time a state delegation is called by the chair of the convention, some person in a funny hat stands up. This is not 2020, because in 2020 they did it virtually, right? But some person in a funny hat stands up and gives some ridiculous little, blurb about their state, and announces how the votes within that delegation were cast. Madam Chairperson, the great state of Idaho is famous for its rustic mountain views and russet potatoes. Proudly cast its, how many ever votes for the next president of the United States, Hillary Clinton. Right? And then once that candidate reaches that magic number, which is a simple majority, 2,300, whatever it was, I don't remember what the exact number was, that's when the balloons and the confetti drop and the music plays and the celebration begins, because now the party has their official nominee. Okay, questions about how that process works? All right. Now let's see how that differs from a caucus process. Because remember, some of the states use, did I open it? Well, this is the Republicans. Look how many, hey, I don't want to spend too much time talking about this side, but because other than what I've already told you, okay? Look how many Republicans were seeking the Republican nomination in 2016 at one point. Remember this guy? And this guy? And some of whom said they would never support Donald Trump, and they ended up supporting Donald Trump. Anyway, let me see if did I not open the, I don't think I opened it up. Let's see here. Yeah, let me back up here for just a second. Well, apparently I didn't move it over. So let me, bear with me here for just a second. So many When I'm opening so many files, sometimes I forget to open one, so bear with me for just a second. Try this one. Okay, so here's how a caucus system works. By the way, this word caucus is one of those terms that has different meanings depending on the context that it's used. For example, later in the semester when we get to our topic on the United States Congress, we're going to talk about party caucuses within the legislature, within Congress, the Democratic caucus, the Republican caucus, okay? In this context, it refers to a system for selecting delegates to the National Convention, okay? So, as I mentioned, the initial event in the presidential nomination process is the Iowa caucuses, right? Now, you can see here that these numbers go back to 2004. I really need to update this, but in 2004, there were 56 delegates from Iowa to the Democratic National Convention. How are those 56 delegates selected? We know how these 440 from California are selected, right? We just described that process because California uses a primary. Or these 27 delegates from New Hampshire, because they use a primary. South Carolina, most of the states use a primary, okay? But the states like Iowa and I think Louisiana used caucuses back in 2004, right? So how are these delegates selected? It works a little bit differently, okay? So here's kind of a general description of how this process works. On the day of the caucuses, voters turn out to their local precinct for a convention, and they publicly announce their support for their preferred candidate. And again, these names are from way back in 2004, so you may recognize them, you may not, okay? Back in 2004, Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts ended up getting the Democratic Party's nomination to run against George W. Bush, okay? But there were a few other candidates, John Edwards, who became Senator Kerry's running mate eventually, okay? Illinois Senator Carol Moseley Braun, who held that Senate seat from Illinois before Barack Obama held the Senate seat for Illinois, okay? Howard Dean from Vermont, former Vermont Governor Howard Dean, right, was another one. There were a number of, as you've seen with the other elections that we've looked at, there's a whole field of candidates out there, right? And so some of the voters support John Kerry, some of the voters support John Edwards, some of the voters support Howard Dean, right? And they all turn out to this precinct convention and they publicly declare who they're supporting. That's one of the differences between a primary and caucus, right? In a primary, it's a secret ballot. Nobody asks you who you're voting for. But in a caucus process, the voters publicly declare their support, right? At some point in the evening, the chair of the convention is going to ask the voters to physically relocate and to caucus with others who support the candidate that they support. To do what? What do you think they're doing? What do you think these voters are doing down here who support John Kerry or these up here that support Howard Dean? They're caucusing to do what? Well, what is the purpose of this process? Well, perhaps ultimately, but not necessarily initially. What's the initial task that they are trying to do? Remember, they're trying to select delegates, right? In primary states, the delegates are selected by primary votes, right? But in caucus states, they're selected by caucus voting. But they're not selecting delegates to the national convention just yet. They're selecting delegates to go to the next round of the caucuses, which is typically a county convention or perhaps a congressional district convention. So in this hypothetical state, from right at this precinct level, let's say it's precinct 13, just to be lucky about it, right? Precinct 13, you have a bunch of voters here for John Kerry, you have a bunch of voters for Howard Dean, a bunch of voters for John Edwards, and they're going to get together and talk about selecting from among themselves who's going to go to the county convention to support John Kerry or Howard Dean, right? Now, look, before we get too far along with this, there's an important point I want you to understand. This is being done publicly, number one, right? But number two, what do you think the primary credential is for someone to be selected as a delegate at precinct convention by John Kerry supporters or by Howard Dean supporters to be selected as a delegate to go to the county convention? Let's imagine that these people up here have turned out this precinct convention. I'm just going to sign it to you. I don't know what your politics are, right? So you'll just tolerate me. They're here to support John Kerry, right? And they get to select based on the math. They get to select a number of delegates to go to the county convention. And they say, well, who should we select? And Joanna says, you know what? I'm not doing anything 2 weeks from today. I'd love to go to the county convention. What do you think those other John Kerry supporters want to know from her before they select her to be a delegate to the county convention? Come on, you know it's not a trick question. What do you think the primary credential is to be selected by a delegate at this precinct convention by all these voters here who supported John Kerry, right? Joanna, you have any thoughts since you've offered your services?
Whoever they select would have to be guaranteed to be a staunch supporter of the person, I would imagine.
Wouldn't you think? Right? If you're gonna consider selecting Joanna to go to the county convention, don't you want to make sure that she really is a supporter of John Kerry and that she can be trusted to vote for John Kerry at the next level? And then you go to the county convention and the same thing happens, right? I'm going the wrong way. Hold on. Go to the county convention, the same thing happens, right? All the Kerry supporters from all these precincts that have come to the county convention were selected by their precinct conventions as delegates to the county convention. Now they're going to caucus and they're going to select delegates for what purpose? Or maybe it's a congressional district convention, county, or it just depends on what state we're talking about, right? Well, the next step is the state, right? So now you're going to caucus to select delegates from among the Kerry supporters to go to the state convention, right? And then at the state convention, they're going to select delegates. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way again. And then at the state convention, they're going to select delegates to go to the national convention, right? And what happens at the national convention? Oh, they actually cast their ballots for the preferred presidential candidate. Okay? So there are a few states that use that caucus process. But whether we're talking about primaries, presidential preference primaries, or whether we're talking about presidential caucuses, the purpose is the same. What they're trying to do is select delegates to a national nominating convention. The purpose of the National Nominating Convention is to officially nominate the party's presidential and vice presidential candidates. Okay, let me pause here, give you a chance to process that information. We've gotten all the way to the National Nominating Conventions, whether it's by way of primary votes or caucus votes. You know, I mentioned to you that this process is kind of complicated. Consider this complication as you're processing that information. In Texas, in the Democratic Party, up through 2012, the Democrats actually used both primaries and caucuses in Texas. It was dropped in both 2016 and 2020. And I'll try to remember to tell you, at least speculate as to why that's the case. If I don't remember to do it on my own, somebody ask, if you're interested. Okay. But at least through 2012, the Texas Democratic Party used both primaries. They used to affectionately refer to it as the Texas two-step. So it was a process where 75% of the delegates from Texas to the Democratic National Convention were determined by a primary vote, and the remaining 25% were determined by caucusing. And I think that the 28 presidential election process in Texas was very telling about how the results can be very interesting, because I think the histories of how Barack Obama became president should heavily emphasize the importance of the caucusing process. And Texas was part of that in 2008. You know, if you go back to early 2008, if you go back to January or even February and March of 2008, all of the newspaper accounts were talking about Hillary Clinton as being the prospective Democratic nominee. It was almost like a coronation. Okay, we're talking about this is a done deal. Hillary Clinton's going to be the Democratic Party nominee. Who else could possibly be a credible candidate? But this little-known senator from Illinois comes along and runs a campaign and ends up getting the Democratic Party nomination. I wonder how that happened. Well, let me give you the short answer to that. I think that the reason that Barack Obama was able to get the Democratic Party nomination in 2008 over the heavily favored Hillary Clinton was because his campaign, he himself and his campaign understood the importance of the caucusing process. And they calculated that they could win this, they could just possibly win this nomination by really heavily dominating the caucusing process. So what we found was that in states that used caucuses like Iowa and Louisiana, Barack Obama won big over Hillary Clinton. In states that used primaries, Hillary Clinton, for the most part, won, but by narrow margins. Texas is an example. So consider that in 2008, Texas was allotted 193 delegates to the Democratic National Convention. Everybody sees that number there, right? Highlighted. From Texas to the Democratic National Convention, 193 delegates. 75% of that was 126 right there. Okay, somebody can check that arithmetic. I think that's 75%. Okay. How are those 126 delegates going to be chosen? Oh, based on the primary voting. So all the voters turn out who voted in the Texas Democratic primary on March, what, do I have a date there? March 4th, 2008, and the early voting period that preceded it, right? And when all the votes were counted, remember how that process works, that primary process works. You go into a voting booth and you cast your ballot for Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama, right? Or whoever else was on the ballot. And the votes are counted at the end of the day on March the 4th. We have the totals, right? When that was done, look how close it was. Hillary Clinton got just over half of the primary vote, about almost 1.5 million votes, and Barack Obama came in second with 1.3 million votes, and that meant that Hillary Clinton, of those 126 delegates right there, Hillary Clinton was pledged, 65 were pledged to Hillary Clinton, and 61 were pledged to Barack Obama. None of these other candidates got 15% of the vote. Okay? What about that other 25%? Okay? Well, Look what happened in the caucus process. You know what the Obama campaign really focused on back in 2008? People who were your age. Now, your age then that you are now, right? First-time voters, people who are really energized by the Obama campaign, right? Turning these people out to the caucus. Because, you know, if you think about it, voting in a caucus requires a little bit more energy than voting in a primary, wouldn't you think? A little bit more of a commitment. And maybe younger people have that energy if they're particularly enthusiastic about a candidate. And they'll turn out to these caucuses in a way that maybe more traditional voters won't turn out. See, it's easy. It's relatively easy. When you think about the relative ease of the two processes, it's easier to vote in a primary than it is to vote in a caucus. You're going to spend an entire evening in the caucusing process, at least. And then you've got, that's just at the precinct level, and then you got the county level, the congressional district level, and the state level, right? There's some level of commitment. Okay, so look what happens in the caucusing process, right? Of the remaining delegates, Barack Obama getting 56% of the caucus vote at the precinct level gets 38 of the delegates, and Hillary Clinton gets 29. And then as you go to the county and senatorial district conventions, it changes just a little bit, but only by one. It goes from 38-29 to 37-30 split. But then when you get to the state convention, it goes back 38-29. So if you add these 38 delegates that Barack Obama has pledged as a result of the caucusing process to the 61 that he's pledged in the primary process, Barack Obama ends up with 99 delegates from Texas, and Hillary Clinton ends up with 94. On the evening of March 4th, go back and check the news accounts again. On the evening of March 4th, 2008, you know what all the newspapers in Texas, the headlines were? The Houston Chronicle and the Dallas Morning News and the Austin American Statesman and the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and whatever it's called in El Paso or Corpus Christi or elsewhere. Hillary Clinton wins Texas primary. But that's because they weren't taking into account a process that's going to take a couple more months to complete, which is the caucusing process. And Barack Obama emerged as the winner of Texas. And I think that's the story, that's a microcosm of the story of how that happened nationally. Now, I told you that the Democrats dropped that in 2016. You know why I think they dropped that? I don't have any evidence, really, much evidence to base this on. But I think the Democratic National Convention, the Democratic National Committee wanted to ensure that a challenger to Hillary Clinton would be less likely to wrest the nomination from her in 2016. Bernie Sanders almost did it. Remember how close Bernie Sanders came to being the Democratic nominee in 2016? But the leaders in the DNC, I think, they had their favorite candidate. It was Hillary Clinton. And they wanted to eliminate this process in as many states as they could, and that included Texas, and just go to a straight primary. They didn't advertise it that way. We're going to drop the caucus process in Texas because we want to make sure that Hillary Clinton is going to be the nominee. Nobody ever said that, right? But it probably more likely they said, well, we're going for an ease of a process for the voter. Make it easier for voters. The primaries are just easier for the voter. Then the voters just go vote in the primary. The supporters of Bernie Sanders cried foul in 2016. Not specifically about Texas. I don't remember specifically anything about that. But they thought that a lot of these rule changes that the Democratic National Committee imposed in the 2016 process were specifically designed to keep Bernie Sanders from successfully challenging Hillary Clinton. Okay. Questions? Comments? Anything? We don't have a whole lot of time left, but let me make these distinctions here real quick so that we can start up with the general election process on Thursday. Okay. I do want to mention that despite what I just said about caucuses, it is mainly primaries, and more states use primaries. In fact, significantly more states use primaries than caucuses. Okay, so let's distinguish here real quick between several different types of primaries. And this would apply, by the way, whether we're talking about presidential preference primaries or direct primaries. Okay, the distinction here that we're about to make is relative to both of these. Okay, so the largest number of states that use primaries use something called a closed primary. Okay, and there are two defining characteristics of a closed primary. First of all, the voter must declare a party affiliation. And that, in some states, that may be done at the time that the voter registers to vote. In other states, it may be a little bit mushier, which I'll try to illustrate here in just a second. The second characteristic is that in these states, a voter can only vote in one party's primary. Can't vote in both. Now, a lot of textbooks, for example, the textbook that we use in the 2306 course, the Texas government course, says that Texas, by the state constitution and the state law, Texas is a closed primary state, but in practice, it is an open primary. I have a little bit of a disagreement with the authors of those textbooks that say that. I'm going to tell you that in Texas, Texas is a closed primary state, but it is a quasi or semi-closed primary. I want to be clear here about what I'm telling you, okay? A lot of textbooks say that Texas is it is effectively an open primary state, which we don't even have up on the screen here yet, okay? But what I'm suggesting to you is based on these two characteristics, Texas is a quasi-closed primary state, because in Texas, you have to declare a party affiliation. Now, you don't do it at the time that you register to vote. I've actually lived in a state when I was in graduate school at the University of Arizona in Tucson. At the time, that was a long time ago, but at that time, when you register to vote, you declare a party affiliation. Let's say for laughs that you declare, you're in Arizona, I'm in Arizona, and I declare affiliation with Party A. My voter registration certificate is going to come back, party affiliation, Party A. So that when primary day comes and I show up at Party B primary to vote, what are they going to tell me? You can't vote here, it's closed to you. Okay? You have to go vote in Party A's primary. You see how that works? A closed primary suggests that it's only open to party members, and it's closed to those who are not party members. Now, again, a quick show of hands because we're out of time. How many of you voted in March 2020 in the primary? Now, you don't have to tell me which party, but did you have to declare a party affiliation? Oh, yes, you did. Okay? You show up to vote, and they say, which party's primary do you want to vote in? And you say Democrat, or you say Republican. And you are declaring for anyone within earshot which party's primary you're voting in. Okay? So you do declare a party affiliation in Texas, and that's one of the reasons I say Texas is a quasi-closed. But you also have the second point, which we'll have to start up with on Thursday. Okay? All right. We'll see you on Thursday.